The setting sun painted long shadows across the weathered concrete of Sullivan's service station. Frank Sullivan stood in the doorway of his garage, wiping grime from calloused hands with a rag that had seen better days. 65 years had etched deep lines into his face like the topography of a hard life carefully mapped. His eyes, still sharp blue beneath steel-gray brows, scanned the empty highway stretching toward the mountains. 15 years of peace in Pinewood, Montana. 15 years of ordinary days, fixing engines and pumping gas. 15 years believing he'd outrun his past. Frank glanced at his watch. 7:30, time to lock up. The familiar weight of his Colt 1911 pressed against his lower back as he reached for the keys. Some habits never die, especially those forged in distant deserts and 3 decades wearing a badge. One day you'll forget that damn thing and feel naked, he muttered to himself, a conversation had countless times before. His fingers brushed the cold metal briefly, a ritual of reassurance. The phone rang inside the office. Frank paused, considered letting it go to voicemail, then sighed and stepped back inside. The clock above the register showed it was 30 minutes past closing time. Sullivan's, he answered, voice gruff from disuse. Most days passed with little conversation beyond transaction necessities. Dad, it's Sarah. Frank's posture changed immediately, tension melting from his shoulders. Sarah, everything okay? His daughter's laugh came through the line, though something in it seemed forced. Why do you always assume something's wrong when I call habit? He replied, though they both knew there was truth in it. Their conversations had grown infrequent over the years, limited mostly to brief birthday calls and strained holiday gatherings. Listen, Dad, Jason and I need to come stay with you for a while. Frank closed his eyes, processing. Jason, his grandson. 10 years old now. Smart kid from what little Frank knew. Sarah had kept the boy at a distance, perhaps afraid Frank would somehow taint him with the same obsessive dedication to duty that had cost Sarah her childhood. What's going on, Sarah? A pause lingered on the line. Eric and I are done. For good this time. Frank fought the urge to say he'd warned her about Eric Campbell years ago. The man had trouble written all over him from day one. Instead, he asked, he hurt you? Not physically, not yet, but things are escalating and I don't want Jason around it anymore. When will you get here? Tomorrow afternoon, if that works. I've already packed the car. Frank nodded to himself. I'll have the spare rooms ready. After hanging up, Frank stood motionless, staring at the yellowed calendar on the wall. A visit from Sarah was rare enough. Her coming to him for shelter was unprecedented. He was still standing there when the distant rumble of motorcycles broke his reverie. Most people heard motorcycle engines as a singular sound. Frank Sullivan heard the distinctive cadence of each bike, the specific tune of precision-engineered mechanical symphonies. These were Harley-Davidsons, at least 6 of them approaching from the east. Frank moved to the doorway again, his right hand instinctively adjusting his shirt to better conceal his weapon. The approaching sound brought back memories of another life, another time. Not all of them unpleasant. The bikes appeared on the highway silhouettes against the purple mountain twilight. They slowed as they neared the station, their headlights cutting through the gathering dusk like accusatory fingers. The late rider turned into the station's gravel lot, the others following in tight formation. Military precision, Frank noted. Not your typical weekend riders. The man on the lead bike, a meticulously maintained Harley Road King, cut the engine and removed his helmet. Even in the fading light, Frank recognized him instantly. Michael Duke Reynolds, 6'2", broad-shouldered despite his 63 years, with a silver beard trimmed with the same precision he'd once applied to field-stripping a rifle. The two men had once trusted each other with their lives. That seemed like several lifetimes ago now. Duke surveyed the modest station, taking in the faded paint and outdated pumps. When his eyes finally settled on Frank, a complicated smile crossed his weathered face. Sullivan, he called, his voice carrying across the lot. Still hiding out in the middle of nowhere, I see. Frank didn't move from his position in the doorway. Not hiding, retired. Duke laughed, the sound genuine if tinged with something darker. Is that what you call it? He dismounted and approached his gait, steady and purposeful. Behind him, the other riders remained on their bikes, engines idling. As Duke drew nearer, Frank noted the patch on his leather vest. A stylized eagle clutching a wrench in one talon and a rifle in the other, surrounded by the words, Iron Veterans MC. Not outlaws, then. one of the support clubs that had proliferated after so many soldiers returned from the Middle East with skills unsuited for civilian life and a hunger for brotherhood. "You look good, Frank," Duke said when they stood face to face. "Country living agrees with you," Frank nodded. "What brings iron veterans to Pinewood just passing through?" Duke's expression shifted, humor falling away. "Wish it were that simple. Mind if we talk inside?" Frank hesitated, then nodded toward the small office attached to the garage. "Coffee's old, but it's hot." "Perfect, just like the old days." Duke turned and signaled to his companions who cut their engines. "Give us 10, he called to them. Inside the cramped office, Frank poured 2 mugs of coffee so dark it bordered on petroleum. Duke accepted his with a nod of thanks and took an appreciative sip. "Christ, that's terrible," he said with a grin. "You always did make the worst coffee in the unit." Frank allowed himself a small smile. "Some things don't change." Duke set his mug down and leaned against the counter. "Some things do. Heard you made lieutenant before you quit the force." 15 years ago? Long time. Duke studied him, but not long enough, apparently. Frank felt his guard rise. Meaning Marcus Reed got out of Deer Lodge prison last month. The name hit Frank like a physical blow. Marcus Reed, nephew of James Cooper, the last case Frank had worked before walking away from his badge. "I know," Frank said carefully. "I still have contacts." Duke nodded. "Then you also know he's rebuilt the Nomad Riders. Bigger than before. Meaner. The Nomad Riders, a motorcycle gang that had terrorized 3 states before Frank's testimony, had helped put Reed away for 15 years on racketeering and drug trafficking charges. "Montana's a big state," Frank said. "Plenty of road for them that doesn't pass through Pinewood." Duke's expression darkened. "Reed's been asking questions, Frank? About you? About Cooper? About what happened to the money and the product that went missing that night?" Frank's jaw tightened. $2 million in cash and 20 kilos of heroin had disappeared the night James Cooper, Frank's partner and friend, put his service weapon in his mouth and pulled the trigger. The official report concluded Cooper had stashed it somewhere before taking his life, but it had never been recovered. "That's ancient history," Frank said. Duke laughed without humor. "Not to Reed, it isn't. Word is he's heading this way, soon." Frank took a slow sip of his coffee, mind racing. Sarah and Jason were coming tomorrow. If Reed was truly headed to Pinewood— "Why are you telling me this?" Frank asked. "Professional courtesy and an offer." Duke straightened up. "Iron Veterans provides security for businesses in several towns across Montana. Protection from predators like Reed and his crew." Frank's eyes narrowed. "Protection, like the kind Reed used to offer pay up or suffer the consequences." "We're not criminals, Frank. We're veterans looking out for our communities when the law can't or won't." "Vigilantes." Duke's expression hardened. "We prefer community security specialists." Frank set his mug down with deliberate care. "I appreciate the warning, Duke, but I don't need protection. Pinewood has a sheriff's department." "Bill Thompson," Duke scoffed. "The man's counting the days to retirement. He and his 2 deputies aren't equipped to handle what's coming." Frank didn't argue the point. Bill Thompson had been a good sheriff once, but the years had worn him down. These days he spent more time fishing than enforcing the law. "I can handle myself," Frank said. Duke studied him, disappointment evident. Same old Frank. Too proud to ask for help, too righteous to bend the rules even when playing by them gets people killed. He moved toward the door, then stopped. Cooper trusted the system too. Right up until he didn't. Frank felt heat rise in his neck. "Leave Cooper out of this." "I wish I could," Duke's voice softened, "but this isn't just about Reed wanting revenge on you for testifying. This is about what Cooper hid, what Reed thinks you know." "I don't know anything about that money." Duke's eyes locked with Frank's. "Are you sure about that, Lieutenant? Because if Reed finds you before he finds that cash, he'll make you wish you did." With that, Duke walked out, leaving Frank alone with thoughts he'd buried 15 years ago. Thoughts of his partner, James Cooper. Of evidence that never added up. Of a suicide that had always felt wrong. Frank followed Duke outside and watched as the Iron Veterans mounted their bikes. "Think about my offer," Duke called over the rumble of engines. "For old time's sake, and for your family's sake." Frank's blood went cold. What do you know about my family? Duke's expression was unreadable in the gathering darkness. I know Sarah's marriage is falling apart. I know she's heading here with your grandson. At Frank's surprised look, Duke shrugged. Small towns, Frank. People talk. The Iron Veterans roared away, leaving Frank standing alone in the gravel lot as night fell completely over the mountains. For the first time in years, his hand moved unconsciously to rest on the butt of his concealed Colt. Tomorrow his daughter and grandson would arrive seeking safety. Tonight he needed to prepare for war. The morning brought low clouds that clung to the mountains surrounding Pinewood, promising rain by afternoon. Frank had slept poorly, his dreams haunted by James Cooper's dead eyes and the sound of Sarah's voice on the phone. He unlocked the station at 6 as always, though his mind wasn't on oil changes or the fuel delivery scheduled for midday. Instead, he found himself cataloging sightlines and defensive positions, old habits resurfacing with disturbing ease. The cabin, he decided. If trouble was truly coming, his home on the edge of town was too exposed. The hunting cabin his father had built in the foothills would be better. Remote, defensible, stocked with enough supplies to last weeks if necessary. The morning passed slowly, few customers disturbing the quiet. Frank used the time to call Bill Thompson, trying to gauge if the sheriff was aware of the potential threat. Reed, Bill's voice crackled over the line. Yeah, I heard rumors he's rebuilding the Nomad Riders. Nothing official, though. He might be headed this way, Frank said. Because of you. The question hung heavy. Maybe. Bill sighed. Frank, that was 15 years ago. You really think he's still carrying that grudge? Men like Reed don't forget. And there's the missing money. Christ, Frank. That again, Cooper took that secret to his grave. Even if Reed thinks you know something, he'd be stupid to come after a former cop. Frank didn't argue. Bill had never believed there was anything suspicious about Cooper's suicide or the missing evidence. To him, it was simple. Cooper was dirty, got caught, and took the coward's way out. Just keep an eye out, Frank said finally. Always do. But Frank, Bill's voice softened, maybe it's time to let the past stay buried, for your sake. After hanging up, Frank found himself staring at the old photograph on his desk. 4 men in desert camo, arms around each other's shoulders, squinting into harsh sunlight. Frank Duke Cooper and Tom Riley. Special Forces Operation Eagle Claw 1980. Before everything went wrong. Riley had died in the Iranian desert. Cooper by his own hand in a Montana basement. Duke had chosen a different path after discharge, one that eventually led him to the Iron Veterans. And Frank had sought redemption in a badge only to discover that justice and law weren't always the same thing. The bell over the door jingled, pulling Frank from his memories. An elderly woman entered, smiling warmly. Morning, Edith, Frank greeted her. The Lincoln giving you trouble again. Just the usual checkup, she replied, handing him her keys. And I wanted to be the first to welcome Sarah back to town. Heard she's coming home today. News traveled fast in Pinewood. Frank nodded, unsurprised that Edith knew. Just for a visit. With that grandson of yours, too. About time you got to know the boy properly. She fixed him with a pointed look. Family's all that matters in the end, Frank Sullivan. As Edith departed, Frank found himself considering her words. Family. He'd failed Sarah as a father, always putting the job first. The same way he'd failed Mary, his wife, before cancer took her 20 years ago. The same way he'd failed Cooper, choosing to build a case against him rather than finding another way. Frank was still pondering these regrets when he heard the distinctive rumble of motorcycles again. Not the disciplined formation of the Iron Veterans this time. Something wilder, more chaotic. He moved to the window hand, automatically reaching for his weapon. A column of motorcycles appeared on the highway, at least a dozen, their chrome and black paint gleaming in the midday sun that had briefly broken through the clouds. Their leader rode a custom chopper, its extended forks and ape-hanger handlebars creating an aggressive silhouette. Frank didn't need to see the patches on their leather cuts to know who they were. Nomad Riders, and at their head, Marcus Reed. The procession roared past the station without slowing, heading toward the center of Pinewood. Frank watched until they disappeared around a bend, then reached for the phone. He dialed Sarah's number with trembling fingers. Dad, we're about an hour out, she answered. Change of plans. Frank said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Text me when you reach the county line. I'll meet you at Miller's Crossing. Don't come into town. What, why? Just trust me, Sarah, please. A pause. Is this about Eric? Did he call you? No, it's something else. I'll explain when I see you. After hanging up, Frank closed the station, putting up the family emergency sign he kept for rare occasions. Then he drove to his house on the edge of town, taking back roads to avoid being seen. Inside, he moved with practiced efficiency, gathering essentials for the cabin. Closed food first aid supplies, ammunition for the Colt, and for the Remington 870 shotgun he kept locked in a gun safe. A second handgun, a compact Glock 19 for Sarah if needed. As he packed, Frank's mind flashed back to 2008, the drug bust that had gone sideways, finding evidence that his partner and friend James Cooper was on the take. The agonizing decision to report him. The late-night phone call. Cooper's wife hysterical, saying James had locked himself in the basement. By the time Frank arrived, Cooper was dead. Self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. The official ruling was clear: corrupt cop takes own life rather than face justice. Case closed. Except the money and drugs Cooper had allegedly stolen were never found. And certain details never added up. Like why Cooper, meticulous in everything, left no suicide note. Or why his final call had been to Frank, a call Frank had missed while briefing the internal affairs investigators. Frank had carried those questions for 15 years. Now it seemed they had finally caught up with him. He was loading the truck when his phone rang. Bill Thompson. Frank, the sheriff said without preamble. Reed and his crew just rolled into Maggie's Diner. Thought you should know. Maggie's was Pinewood's only real restaurant, a popular gathering spot on Main Street. What are they doing? Just eating for now, but they're making everyone nervous, loud, taking up half the place. Anyone ask what brings them to town? Tried casual conversation. Reed said they were just passing through. Bill paused. He asked if I knew you. Frank closed his eyes. What did you tell him? That you keep to yourself mostly, run the service station, regular customer at the diner. Another pause. He seemed very interested in that last part. Bill, my daughter and grandson are on their way here. I need to get them somewhere safe. The sheriff sighed heavily. Frank, I can't arrest the man for eating lunch and asking questions. He hasn't broken any laws. Yet, Bill conceded. Look, I'll keep an eye on them. Let you know if they leave town. But Frank, be careful. Don't do anything stupid. Frank hung up and finished loading the truck. As he worked, rain began to fall, fat drops that quickly turned to a steady downpour. The storm that had threatened all morning had finally arrived. He was about to leave when another vehicle turned into his driveway, a familiar sheriff's department SUV. Bill Thompson stepped out, rain darkening his uniform as he approached. Thought you were watching Reed, Frank said. Deputy Ramirez is on it. Bill eyed the loaded truck. Going somewhere. Taking Sarah and Jason to the cabin for a few days, until I figure this out. Bill nodded slowly. Probably smart, but there's something you should know first. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded paper. This came across my desk this morning. Figured you'd want to see it sooner rather than later. Frank unfolded the paper. It was a copy of a death certificate. James Cooper's wife, Elizabeth, dated 3 weeks ago. Cause of death, stage 4 breast cancer. Cooper's widow, Frank murmured. Reed's aunt, Bill corrected. And there's more. She changed her will just before she died. Left everything to Reed, including a safe deposit box at First Montana Bank in Helena. Box was empty when Reed went to claim it. Frank looked up sharply. Empty. Bill nodded. But according to bank records, Elizabeth Cooper accessed that box exactly once 15 years ago. 1 week after her husband's suicide. The implications were clear. Elizabeth Cooper had removed whatever her husband had placed in that box. Something important enough that Marcus Reed would track down Frank Sullivan after 15 years. Reed thinks I know where it is, Frank said quietly. Do you? Frank met his old friend's gaze steadily. No, Cooper and I weren't exactly on speaking terms when he died. Bill studied him, then nodded. I believe you, but Reed won't. And now he knows you frequent Maggie's Diner. He's setting a trap. Looks that way. Bill glanced at the loaded truck again. The cabin's a good idea. I'll check in when I can. Frank's phone buzzed with a piston, Sarah letting him know they were at the county line. I need to go, Frank said. Bill nodded. Be careful, Frank. Reed did 15 years thinking about revenge. Men like that don't just let go. As Bill drove away, Frank made a final check of the house, ensuring nothing essential was left behind. His gaze lingered on a photograph of Sarah as a child sitting on his shoulders at a county fair. Her mother had taken it one of the rare days Frank had taken off work. One of the few happy memories from a childhood marked by his absences. He couldn't fail her again, or his grandson. Frank was halfway to Miller's Crossing when his phone rang again. Unknown number. He almost ignored it, then reconsidered. Sullivan, he answered cautiously. They're at the diner, Frank. Duke's voice was tense. Reed and his crew, asking about you. I know. Sheriff called me. What he doesn't know is that they've got men watching your house in the station. Professional setup. Frank's grip tightened on the steering wheel. How do you know that? We've been tracking them since they crossed into the county. Got eyes on them now. Frank processed this information. I appreciate the heads up. It's more than that, Duke said. I owe you, Frank, Afghanistan. That night in Kandahar. I haven't forgotten. The memory surfaced unbidden. A mission gone wrong. Duke pinned down by enemy fire. Frank disobeying direct orders to go back for him, both of them barely making it out alive. Ancient history, Frank muttered. Not to me. Duke's voice hardened. Reed is dangerous, Frank, more than you know. He's not just a thug anymore. He's connected. Spent his time in prison building relationships with serious players. What do you suggest? A pause. Meet me at the old logging road turnoff just past Miller's Crossing. Bring your family. We'll escort you to somewhere safe. Frank hesitated. Working with Duke meant stepping outside the law he'd upheld his entire career. But with Sarah and Jason's safety at stake. I'll think about it, he said finally. Don't think too long, Duke warned. Reed's not known for patience. The line went dead. Frank continued toward Miller's Crossing mine racing. The rain had intensified, reducing visibility and turning the mountain road treacherous. He slowed as he approached the meeting point, scanning for Sarah's car. There it was, pulled off on a gravel turnout. A blue Subaru Outback, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the downpour. He could make out two figures inside, one small, one adult. Frank pulled up alongside and rolled down his window. Sarah did the same, her expression a mixture of concern and irritation. Dad, what's going on? Why are we meeting here in the rain? Change of plans, Frank said, trying to sound calmer than he felt. We're going to my hunting cabin for a few days. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Why? I'll explain everything once we're there. It's safer. Safer, Dad? You're scaring me. Grandpa, a small voice called from the passenger seat. Jason leaned across his mother, peering out with curious eyes. Dark hair. Mary's nose, Sarah's determined chin. Frank felt a pang of regret for all the birthdays and Christmases he'd missed. Hey, buddy. Frank managed a smile. Sorry about the rain. We'll have better weather at the cabin, I promise. Does it have internet? Jason asked, practical concerns foremost in a 10-year-old's mind. No internet, Frank admitted, but plenty of books and card games. Sarah was still studying him with suspicion. This isn't about Eric, is it? What aren't you telling me? Frank sighed. It's complicated, but I need you to trust me right now. He glanced in his rearview mirror, suddenly alert. Headlights appeared through the rain, approaching fast. Follow me. Stay close. He pulled back onto the road without waiting for Sarah's response, relieved when her car followed. The approaching vehicle drew nearer, high beams cutting through the rain. Frank tensed hand, moving toward his weapon. The vehicle roared past a logging truck, nothing more. Frank exhaled slowly, forcing his racing heart to calm. Paranoia wouldn't help them now. 5 minutes later, they approached the turnoff for the old logging road Duke had mentioned. Frank slowed, debating. Ahead lay the main route to his cabin. To the right, Duke and the Iron Veterans. Law and order versus vigilante justice. A lifetime of choices distilled to a single moment. Frank signaled right and turned onto the logging road, checking to ensure Sarah followed. The narrow dirt track was slick with mud, requiring his full concentration to navigate. A quarter-mile in the trees opened to a small clearing. 3 motorcycles waited, their riders sheltered beneath a hastily erected tarp. Duke stepped forward as Frank parked, his expression grim. Sarah pulled up behind Frank, her confusion evident as she took in the scene. Jason pressed his face to the window, eyes wide at the motorcycles and their leather-clad riders. You made the right choice, Duke said, as Frank exited his truck. We'll see. Sarah approached, positioning herself protectively between Jason and the strangers. Dad, what is this? Who are these people? Old friends, Frank replied, then made introductions. Sarah, this is Michael Reynolds. We serve together. Duke, my daughter Sarah, and grandson Jason. Duke nodded respectfully to Sarah, then crouched to Jason's eye level. Those are some serious rain clouds you brought with you, young man. Jason, shy but curious, nodded. Are you really my grandpa's friend? One of his oldest, Duke confirmed, though he might not admit it these days. Frank cut in. Duke says we're being watched, that it's not safe at the cabin. Watched by who? Sarah demanded. Dad, you need to explain what's happening right now. Frank exchanged a look with Duke, who nodded encouragingly. It's about a case I worked 15 years ago. A man named Marcus Reed was sent to prison based partly on my testimony. He's out now and in Pinewood looking for something he thinks I have. Do you have it? Sarah asked. No, but he won't believe that. So call the police. I did, but there's not much they can do until Reed actually breaks the law. Duke stepped forward. Which he will, Mrs. Campbell. Reed isn't here for a social visit. He's here for revenge and for whatever his uncle hid before dying. Sarah looked between them, confusion giving way to understanding, then fear. Are we in danger? Potentially, Frank admitted. That's why we need to go somewhere Reed won't think to look. I've got a place, Duke said. Hunting lodge about 30 miles from here, deep in National Forest land. Secure, stocked with supplies off the grid. And full of your motorcycle gang friends? Sarah asked skeptically. Duke smiled slightly. Iron veterans aren't a gang, ma'am. We're a club, mostly former military looking out for each other and our communities. By operating outside the law, sometimes the law moves too slow, Duke replied evenly, especially when lives are at stake. Frank interrupted before the debate could escalate. Right now, we need somewhere safe while I figure this out. Duke's offering help we need. Sarah studied him, then nodded reluctantly. Fine, but I want the whole story once we're there. As they prepared to move out, Frank's phone rang again. Bill Thompson. Frank, where are you? The sheriff's voice was tight with urgency. On my way to a safe location with Sarah and Jason. What's happening? Reed and his crew just left the diner, headed toward your station. Frank felt cold dread settle in his stomach. Bill, I need you to do something for me. Check the station's security cameras remotely. Let me know what they do. Already on it, Bill replied. Frank, be careful. These guys aren't just local troublemakers. I ran some checks. Reed's got connections to serious organizations now. Prison affiliations with white supremacist gangs, suspected ties to gun runners. Keep me posted, Frank said, then hung up and turned to Duke. They're moving on the station now. Duke nodded grimly. Expected. They'll hit your house next when they don't find you. We need to move, Frank said. Now. They set off in a small convoy, Duke leading on his motorcycle, followed by Frank's truck and Sarah's Subaru. Two more Iron veterans brought up the rear, providing security against potential pursuit. The rain continued to fall, turning the logging road into a treacherous ribbon of mud. Frank drove carefully, mindful of Sarah behind him, frequently checking his mirrors for any sign of trouble. His phone buzzed with a text from Bill. At station. Breaking in, searching office. Minutes later, another, leaving now, headed toward your house. Frank relayed the updates to Duke at their next stop, a junction where the logging road met a narrower Forest Service track. They'll figure out you're gone soon enough, Duke said. Question is, where will they think you've gone? The cabin, Frank said with certainty. It's the obvious choice. Duke nodded, which works in our favor. Lodge is in the opposite direction. As they continued their journey deeper into the national forest, the rain finally began to slacken. Weak sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the ancient pines that crowded the narrow road. Frank's phone rang again. Bill. They hit your house, the sheriff said, without preamble. Tore the place apart. Frank winced. Anyone hurt? No, my deputies and I stayed back, observed only. Didn't have enough cause or manpower to intervene. Bill sounded apologetic. Frank, they weren't just searching, they were sending a message. Places trashed. Frank thought of the photographs, the mementos of Mary, the few precious items he'd kept from a life spent mostly in service to others. All likely destroyed now. There's more, Bill continued. While most of them were at your place, Reed himself went to visit Helen Cooper. Frank nearly drove off the road in surprise. James Cooper's mother, she's still alive. 92 and sharp as ever. Lives at Pinewood Assisted Living now. Helen Cooper. Frank hadn't spoken to her since James's funeral, where she'd refused to acknowledge his presence. The mother who had raised James and his sister Elizabeth alone after their father died in a mining accident. The woman who had once welcomed Frank into her home like a second son, then shut him out completely after James's death. What did Reed want with her? Frank asked. Don't know. Staff said he was respectful, brought flowers, stayed about 20 minutes. An old woman who had lost both her children visited by her grandson fresh from prison. It could have been an innocent family reunion, but Frank doubted it. Thanks, Bill. Let me know if anything else happens. Will do, and Frank, I've got a deputy watching the road to your hunting cabin, just in case. Frank's next call was to Duke riding ahead of the convoy. Reed visited Helen Cooper at the nursing home, Frank reported. Duke was silent for a moment. Interesting, very interesting. What do you make of it? I'm thinking maybe old Helen knows more than she's been letting on all these years. The convoy continued deeper into the forest, the road narrowing further until it was little more than a dirt track winding between towering pines. The late afternoon sun slanted through the trees, creating alternating patterns of light and shadow. Frank checked his mirrors, again confirming Sarah was still following. In the passenger seat of her Subaru, Jason's face was pressed against the window, taking in the wild scenery with evident wonder. At least the boy might enjoy this unexpected adventure, Frank thought. A small consolation in a situation spiraling rapidly out of control. Finally, after nearly 2 hours of careful navigation through increasingly remote terrain, they arrived at the hunting lodge. It was larger than Frank had expected, a substantial log structure nestled in a clearing with a sweeping view of the valley below. Government originally built it as a firewatch station in the 1950s, Duke explained as they parked. Iron veterans lease it now, remote enough to give us privacy, close enough to civilization when we need supplies. Sarah emerged from her car, stretching after the long drive. Jason bounded out, his initial trepidation forgotten in the excitement of exploring new territory. Can I look around? He asked eagerly. Stay where I can see you, Sarah cautioned. As Jason began investigating the clearing, Duke led Frank and Sarah toward the lodge. Inside, it was surprisingly comfortable, with a large common area centered around a stone fireplace, a well-equipped kitchen, and several bedrooms branching off a central hallway. Solar power rainwater collection system, wood stove for heat, Duke said with evident pride. We can stay off the grid indefinitely if needed. How many of your members use this place? Sarah asked. Varies. Right now, just the 3 of us who escorted you. More can come if necessary. Frank moved to the large windows overlooking the valley, scanning the terrain with a soldier's eye. Defensible position, good sight lines, multiple escape routes if needed. Duke had chosen well. I promised you the whole story, Frank said, turning to Sarah. You should sit down. As Sarah settled onto a worn leather sofa, Frank began the painful process of excavating the past. James Cooper, their partnership, the drug case that had gone sideways, the evidence implicating Cooper, Frank's agonizing decision to report him, the suicide. The official story was simple, Frank explained. Cooper was dirty, got caught, took the easy way out rather than face justice. Case closed. But you didn't believe it, Sarah said, her expression thoughtful. I believed he was involved somehow. The evidence was clear on that, but certain things never added up. Frank paced as he spoke, the memories flowing now. Cooper was meticulous, detail-oriented. The idea that he'd kill himself without leaving affairs in order, without a note, without explanation. It never sat right. And the missing money and drugs, Sarah asked. Never found. Assumed Cooper hid them before dying. Which is what Reed is after now, Duke added, joining the conversation from where he'd been respectfully listening near the door. $2 million and 20 kilos of heroin, worth considerably more now than 15 years ago. Sarah's eyes widen, and he thinks you know where it is. Why would he think that? Frank hesitated, then admitted the truth he'd carried for 15 years. Because Cooper called me the night he died. Left a voicemail I didn't hear until after it was too late. What did it say? Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. Frank closed his eyes, the words etched in his memory. He said, Frank, it's not what you think. I need to explain. Meet me at our spot. Come alone. Your spot. An old fishing cabin by Miller's Creek, where we used to go on weekends. Frank's voice roughened with emotion. I was briefing internal affairs when he called. By the time I checked my messages and got to his house, he was already dead. Sarah absorbed this, her expression softening slightly. You think he was going to explain everything, maybe tell you where the money was? I don't know, maybe. Or maybe he was just going to try to justify what he'd done. Frank shook his head. Doesn't matter now. Except that Reed thinks it does, Duke pointed out. He believes Cooper told you something, or left you something, a clue to where the money is hidden. Which isn't true, Frank insisted. Duke's expression was skeptical. You sure about that? Frank Cooper was smart. Maybe he left something you haven't recognized yet. Frank was about to respond when his phone rang yet again. Bill Thompson. They found your cabin, the sheriff said without preamble. Set it on fire. Frank felt sick. The family hunting cabin built by his father's hands filled with generations of memories. Gone. My deputy tried to intervene, Bill continued. They ran him off, fired shots over his head. Is he okay? Shaken up but unharmed. Frank, this crosses the line. I've called in the state police for backup. We'll find Reed and his crew, put them away for arson at minimum. Be careful, Bill. Reed's dangerous. So am I when someone threatens my town. Bill's voice hardened with resolve Frank hadn't heard in years. Where are you? Are you safe? Frank glanced at Duke, who shook his head slightly. Even Bill couldn't know their location. Too risky. We're safe, Frank said. That's all you need to know right now. After hanging up, Frank relayed the news about the cabin. Sarah looked stunned. They burned it down just like that. Sending another message, Duke said grimly. They're escalating, Frank. This won't end until Reed gets what he wants, or someone stops him permanently. The implication hung heavy in the room. Frank had spent his life upholding the law, believing in the system despite its flaws. Duke and his iron veterans operated outside that system by necessity or choice. Now with his family threatened and his past returned to haunt him, Frank Sullivan stood at a crossroads. Trust the law that had failed James Cooper and might fail him now, or embrace Duke's brand of frontier justice. The sound of Jason's laughter drifted through the open window as he explored the clearing outside, innocent, unaware of the danger circling ever closer. Frank made his decision. I need to end this, he said quietly, before anyone else gets hurt. Duke nodded, understanding immediately. We'll help you, brother, whatever it takes. Sarah looked between them, alarm growing on her face. Dad, what are you planning? Before Frank could answer, one of the iron veterans burst through the door, his expression urgent. Vehicles approaching, he reported, at least 3 moving fast up the access road. Duke moved to the window, cursing under his breath. How the hell did they find us so quickly? Frank joined him, stomach sinking, as he spotted the dust cloud rising from the forest road below. We need to get Sarah and Jason out of here, now. Outside, Jason continued his explorations, oblivious to the danger racing toward them. Sarah rushed to the window, panic flaring in her eyes. Jason, she screamed. Jason, come inside now. The boy looked startled by his mother's tone. Then beyond him, emerging from the trees at the edge of the clearing, a figure appeared. Tall, muscular face hardened by 15 years of prison. Marcus Reed. He smiled at Jason, a predator's grin, then called out loud enough for all to hear. Sullivan, I believe we're overdue for a conversation about my uncle. Frank's hand moved to his concealed weapon as he locked eyes with the man who had burned down his family cabin, invaded his home, and now threatened his grandson. The moment he had dreaded for 15 years had arrived. Marcus Reed had found them, and he wouldn't leave without what he came for, even if it didn't exist. Time seemed to stop as Frank Sullivan stared across the clearing at Marcus Reed. The younger man stood with casual confidence, one hand resting near the waistband of his jeans, where a weapon likely waited. Behind Frank, Duke and his iron veterans had already drawn their firearms, creating a protective perimeter around the lodge. Jason, Frank called, his voice unnaturally calm despite the hammer of his heart. Walk toward me slowly. Don't run. The boy looked between his grandfather and the stranger, confusion evident on his young face. Reed smiled again, raising his hands in mock surrender. I'm not here for the kid, Sullivan, just for what's mine. Sarah appeared beside Frank, her face pale with terror. "Jason, please," she whispered. Jason finally moved, backing away from Reed with cautious steps until he reached the safety of the porch where Frank and Sarah waited. Sarah immediately pulled him inside the lodge, while Frank remained eyes locked with Reed. "How did you find us?" Frank asked. Reed chuckled. "You're not the only one with friends in high places, Lieutenant. Seems your sheriff's department has some communication issues. Scanner chattered about your cabin burning down, mentioned Duke Reynolds and his merry band of veterans heading into the national forest." He gestured broadly at the surrounding wilderness. "Not many places out here to hide." From inside the lodge came the sound of Duke giving orders, positioning his men. Frank knew they were outnumbered. Through the trees, he could see the dust from approaching vehicles growing closer. "What do you want, Reed?" "Don't play dumb. You know exactly what I want." Reed's smile vanished, replaced by cold purpose. $2 million and 20 kilos of heroin, the stuff my uncle stashed before you drove him to eat his gun. I didn't have anything to do with Cooper's death." "Bullshit." Reed's composure cracked momentarily, raw anger flashing across his face. "You were supposed to be his partner, his friend. Instead, you turned on him the first chance you got." "I was doing my job," Frank said, the old justification feeling hollow even as he spoke it. Reed shook his head with disgust. "Always hiding behind that badge. My uncle trusted you, and you betrayed him." He took a step forward. "But that's not why I'm here. I don't give a damn about ancient history. I want what's mine by right of inheritance." Frank held his ground. "I don't have it. Never did." "See, that's where you're wrong." Reed reached into his jacket, causing Frank's hand to twitch toward his weapon. But Reed produced only a folded piece of paper. "My Aunt Elizabeth gave me this before she died. Said it was from Uncle James." Frank's breath caught. A note from Cooper after all these years. "It's a list of numbers," Reed continued. "Coordinates maybe, or a code. She didn't know, but she said James told her that if anything happened to him, I should take it to his partner." His lips twisted into a bitter smile. "That would be you, Sullivan. I don't know anything about any numbers." Reed's patience visibly thinned. "Maybe you need motivation to remember." He gestured toward the lodge where Sarah and Jason were sheltering. "I've got nothing against your family, but $2 million is a powerful incentive for jogging memories." The threat hung in the air between them. Behind Reed, the first of his reinforcements emerged from the forest road, motorcycles growling as they approached the clearing. "You've got until sunset," Reed said, backing toward his arriving comrades. "Figure out what these numbers mean, or I start getting creative." He tossed the folded paper onto the ground between them. "Consider it a gesture of good faith." Frank remained motionless until Reed had rejoined his crew at the edge of the clearing, then quickly retrieved the paper and retreated to the lodge. Inside, Duke and his men had established defensive positions at windows and doorways. Sarah sat with Jason in the kitchen area, trying to maintain calm for his sake. "What did he say?" Duke demanded as Frank entered. Frank unfolded the paper Reed had given him. A series of numbers, just as Reed had described, written in what was unmistakably James Cooper's handwriting. Frank recognized the distinctive way Cooper formed his sevens and fours. "Cooper left a message after all," Frank said quietly, passing the paper to Duke. "Reed thinks these numbers lead to the missing money and drugs." Duke studied the sequence, his brow furrowed. "Could be coordinates, or a safe combination." "Or nothing," Frank countered. "A wild goose chase Cooper set up knowing Reed would eventually come looking." Sarah approached, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. "How many of them are out there?" Frank moved to the window. Reed and his nomad riders had established their own perimeter at the edge of the clearing, a dozen men with motorcycles and now 3 pickup trucks. A small army. "Too many to fight our way out," he admitted. "And they've got the only road blocked," Duke added. "We're surrounded." Frank turned to Sarah, seeing the accusation in her eyes, the silent blame for bringing this danger to her and Jason. He couldn't disagree. His past had finally caught up with him, and they were paying the price. "I'm sorry," he said simply. Sarah's expression softened slightly. "It's not your fault." She glanced at Jason, who was examining the lodge's collection of old board games, blissfully unaware of the danger. "Not entirely." Frank nodded gratefully, then turned back to the numbers on the paper. What had Cooper been trying to tell him after all these years? "Reed gave us until sunset to figure it out," Frank explained. After that, he starts getting creative. Duke cursed under his breath. That gives us maybe 3 hours, not much time. Time for what? Sarah asked. You don't actually believe this leads to some hidden treasure, do you? Doesn't matter what I believe, Frank said. Reed believes it, and that makes it real enough. He spread the paper on the kitchen table, examining it more carefully. The sequence was arranged in 4 lines, and 28, 94, 16, 52, 37, 61, 09, 75, 82, 30, 48, 22, 63, 77. It's not GPS coordinates, Duke said. Wrong format. Frank nodded absently, his mind racing through possibilities. Not a phone number either. Too many digits. One of Duke's men, a wiry veteran named Mac, who Frank had learned was a former intelligence officer, joined them at the table. Could be a book cipher, page-line word. That would require knowing which book, though. Cooper and I both read a lot, Frank mused, but I can't think of any book that had special significance to both of us. Sarah had been watching the numbers with growing interest. What about a date? 4 sets of numbers could represent months, days, years. Frank considered this. Maybe, but what would the dates mean? The conversation continued as they explored and discarded various theories. Meanwhile, the sun inched closer to the horizon, and the nomad riders maintained their silent vigil around the clearing. Jason approached the table, drawn by the intensity of the adults' discussion. What are you doing? Sarah tried to steer him away, but Frank stopped her. It's okay. He turned to his grandson. We're trying to solve a puzzle, Jason. It's important. The boy studied the numbers with interest, like a secret code. Exactly like that. Frank smiled despite the circumstances. Got any ideas? Jason considered the numbers seriously. In school, we learned about different codes, like sometimes letters can be numbers. A is 1, B is 2, like that. Frank glanced at Duke, who raised his eyebrows. Kid might be onto something. What if it's a simple substitution cipher, numbers representing letters? They tried this approach, converting each number to its corresponding letter in the alphabet, but the result was nonsensical. More dead ends followed as they experimented with other common ciphers, each failure bringing sunset closer. Frank paced the lodge, frustration mounting. Cooper had been meticulous, a planner. Whatever message he'd left would be something Frank could understand without external references or specialized knowledge. Think Sullivan, he muttered to himself. What would Cooper expect you to know? His phone buzzed with a text from Bill Thompson. State police delayed by storm damage on highway. Won't arrive until morning. Reed's crew has disappeared from town. Where are you? Frank didn't respond. The state police wouldn't arrive in time, and telling Bill their location might only put more people in danger if Reed had infiltrated the department. As Frank put his phone away, he noticed Jason playing with the paper, turning it different directions. Maybe it's not numbers, the boy suggested. Maybe it's a picture. Frank paused. A memory surfaced, something from his and Cooper's academy days. Their instructor teaching them about one-time pads and encryption techniques. Son of a gun, Frank breathed. Jason, you might be right. He took the paper and rotated it 90 degrees clockwise, then squinted at it. The numbers viewed from this angle and with some imagination formed crude block letters, cabin safe behind photo blue book. It's a visual code, Frank explained to the others who had gathered around. Cooper and I learned it at the academy. Numbers arranged to form letters when viewed from the right angle. Duke studied the revealed message. What cabin yours? That Reed burned down. Frank shook his head. No, the fishing cabin Cooper and I used to go to, the one he asked me to meet him at the night he died. He looked out the window at the waiting nomad riders. That's where the money is. Has to be. But your cabin burned down, Sarah pointed out. How does that help us now? Not my cabin, Frank clarified. Cooper's old fishing cabin. On Miller's Creek. It wasn't in his name, so it wouldn't have been seized when he died. It belonged to his uncle, who left it to him. Understanding dawned on Duke's face. And if no one knew about it, the money could still be there, Frank finished. 15 years later, just waiting to be found. The revelation brought momentary hope, quickly tempered by reality. They were still surrounded with no way to reach Miller's Creek, even if they wanted to. So what's our play? Duke asked. Tell Reed where the money is and hope he lets us go. Frank considered their options. Reed won't trust us. He'll want me to lead him there. He glanced at Sarah and Jason. But I won't leave my family. Then we all go, Duke said, under our terms. The plan took shape quickly. Duke would approach Reed under a flag of truce, offering him to lead them to the money in exchange for safe passage for Sarah and Jason. Frank would accompany Reed to Cooper's cabin, while Duke's men ensured his family reached safety. Sarah protested vehemently. "This is insane. You're trusting criminals to keep their word." "Reed wants the money more than he wants revenge," Frank said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "And he knows Duke's men will retaliate if anything happens to me." Before Sarah could argue further, Duke returned from his meeting with Reed at the center of the clearing. His expression was grim but determined. "He agreed," Duke reported. "Sarah and Jason leave first in her car with 2 of my men riding escort. Once they're safely away, Frank leads Reed to the cabin." "And the rest of your men?" Frank asked. Duke's smile was cold. "They'll be around. Reed won't see them, but they'll see him." Sarah gripped Frank's arm, tears threatening. "Dad, please. There has to be another way." "There isn't," Frank said gently. "But I'll be okay. This ends today one way or another." As they prepared to execute their plan, Frank took a moment alone with Jason. The boy had been remarkably resilient through the ordeal, but Frank could see the fear beneath his brave facade. "I'm sorry about all this," Frank said. "Not exactly the visit I had planned." Jason nodded solemnly. "Mom says your job was dangerous. That's why you weren't around much when she was little." The observation, so innocent yet cutting, struck Frank to his core. "Your mom was right. I put the job before family too many times." "Are you doing that again now?" Jason asked. Frank considered the question carefully. "No. Everything I'm doing now is for family." He placed a hand on his grandson's shoulder. "Sometimes being there for the people you love means doing hard things to keep them safe." Jason seemed to accept this, though his next words revealed a wisdom beyond his years. "Just don't forget to come back this time, okay?" Frank embraced his grandson fiercely, making a silent vow not to repeat the mistakes of the past. The sun was a bloated red orb kissing the mountain ridges when Sarah's Subaru departed, flanked by 2 iron veterans on motorcycles. Frank watched from the lodge porch, Reed and his men, allowing them passage as agreed. Only when the vehicles disappeared around the bend did Frank descend the steps to where Reed waited. "I hope you've solved our little puzzle," Reed said, cold amusement in his eyes. "I know where the money is," Frank confirmed. "Cooper's fishing cabin on Miller's Creek." Reed studied him for any sign of deception. "That's simple, huh? Cooper knew I'd remember the place. It's where he wanted to meet me the night he died." Frank met Reed's gaze steadily. "There's a safe behind a photograph. The combination is in a blue book. And you expect me to believe that Cooper told you all this 15 years ago? No, he wrote it down knowing someone would eventually come looking." Frank gestured at the mountains. "It'll be dark soon. If we want to reach the cabin tonight, we need to move now." Reed considered this, then nodded. "Fine. You ride with me. Your buddy Duke can follow with 2 of my men. The rest stay here in case this is a trap." The arrangement made Frank found himself in the passenger seat of Reed's pickup truck, navigating the forest roads back towards civilization and ultimately to Miller's Creek. Duke followed in another vehicle, effectively a hostage, to ensure Frank's cooperation. As they drove in tense silence, Frank's thoughts turned to Cooper and the fateful night 15 years ago. Had his partner really been dirty? Or was there more to the story as Cooper had tried to tell him in that final voicemail? "You know," Reed said, breaking the silence, "my uncle talked about you before everything went to hell." Frank glanced at him. "That right? Yeah. Said you were the most honest cop he ever knew. Too honest sometimes." Reed kept his eyes on the winding road. "Funny thing for a corrupt cop to admire, don't you think?" The observation hung between them, Reed clearly fishing for a reaction. Frank provided none, though the comment added to his growing suspicion that Cooper's story was more complicated than it had seemed. As they continued toward Miller's Creek, the landscape gradually transformed from dense national forest to the more populated outskirts of Pinewood County. Frank noted with professional detachment that Reed drove carefully, observing speed limits, taking no risks that might attract attention from passing patrol cars. "Did Cooper ever talk about why he did it?" Frank asked eventually. "Why he got involved with the drug money?" Reed's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Aunt Elizabeth's cancer treatments. Insurance wouldn't cover the experimental stuff. She was dying and the system didn't care." His voice hardened. "Sometimes a man does what he has to for family." The justification was one Frank had heard countless times throughout his career, from petty thieves to hardened criminals. Yet coming from Reed in the context of Cooper's desperate situation, it carried an uncomfortable ring of truth. If that's true, why did the money go missing? Frank pressed. Why not use it for Elizabeth's treatment? Reed shot him a sidelong glance. That's the question, isn't it? Uncle James takes the money for Aunt Elizabeth, then hides it and kills himself without ever spending a dime. Doesn't make sense. He shook his head. Unless he never intended to keep it for himself at all. The implication hung in the air as they continued their journey in silence. Night had fully fallen by the time they reached the narrow dirt road leading to Cooper's fishing cabin. The headlights illuminated an overgrown path that had clearly seen little use in the intervening years. End of the road, Reed said, stopping where the path became impassable to vehicles. We walk from here. The four men continued on foot, Reed and Frank leading Duke, and one of Reed's lieutenants following closely. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant above the tree canopy, their breath forming clouds in the autumn air. After 15 minutes of hiking, they reached the cabin, a simple structure of weathered logs nearly swallowed by encroaching wilderness. The door hung partially open, testament to years of neglect and occasional visitors seeking shelter from the elements. Doesn't look like anyone's been here in ages, Reed commented, sweeping his flashlight across the exterior. That was probably the point, Frank replied. Inside the cabin was a time capsule. Dust covered every surface, but the furnishings remained largely as Frank remembered from his last visit nearly 16 years ago. A small kitchenette, a worn sofa, a wood stove for heat, and a table where he and Cooper had played countless hands of poker after days spent fishing the creek. The photo, Frank said, directing his flashlight to the wall above the sofa. A framed photograph still hung there, showing Cooper and Frank in waders, holding up an impressive rainbow trout between them. Happier days before everything went wrong. Reed approached the photo with obvious anticipation. He removed it from the wall, revealing a small safe embedded in the log wall behind it. Blue book, Frank reminded him. Reed's lieutenant searched the cabin's small bookshelf, quickly locating the only blue volume among the weathered paperbacks. A collection of fishing stories, its pages yellowed with age. There's a folded paper inside. The man reported, extracting a slip similar to the one Reed had shown Frank earlier. Reed snatched it, examining the contents. Another series of numbers. He looked at Frank. The combination, Frank nodded. Must be. With barely contained excitement, Reed turned to the safe and began entering the numbers. The mechanism clicked satisfyingly and the door swung open to reveal nothing. What the hell? Reed stared into the empty safe in disbelief. Where is it? Where's the money? Frank felt a cold weight settle in his stomach. I don't know. It should be here. Reed's face contorted with fury. He grabbed Frank by the collar, shoving him against the wall. You're lying. This was all a setup. Easy, Duke intervened, his voice level but dangerous. Nobody's setting anybody up. The money should be here. Someone got to it first. Reed reluctantly released Frank, pacing the small cabin like a caged animal. Who knew about this place? Cooper's family, maybe, Frank suggested, straightening his jacket. His mother, Helen. Reed shook his head vehemently. Grandma Helen didn't know anything about this place. I asked her directly today. Frank processed this new information. Then someone else found it. Hikers, maybe. Local kids. $2 million doesn't just disappear, Reed exploded. Not without someone talking, spending. There would have been rumors, arrests. He rounded on Frank again. No, this is on you, Sullivan. You found it years ago, didn't you? Kept it for yourself while my uncle rotted in the ground and my aunt died inch by inch. Before Frank could respond, a new voice spoke from the cabin doorway. James Cooper never hid any money here. There never was any money. All four men turned to find Sheriff Bill Thompson standing in the doorway, his service weapon drawn and aimed steadily at Reed. Bill, Frank said, surprise evident in his voice. How did you find us? Thompson's weathered face revealed nothing. Tracked your phone, Frank. Standard procedure when an officer's missing. His eyes never left Reed. Marcus Reed, you're under arrest for arson, destruction of property, threatening an officer, and a dozen other charges I haven't had time to list yet. Reed's laugh was hollow. One old sheriff against the four of us. Those aren't great odds, are they? They improve when you factor in the state police snipers I've got positioned outside, Thompson replied evenly, and the fact that your men back at the lodge are currently being taken into custody. Frank studied his old friend carefully. Something wasn't right. Thompson's stance was too rigid, his eyes too fixed. And state police snipers, the text had said they wouldn't arrive until morning. Bill, Frank said cautiously, what's going on? Thompson's gaze flickered to Frank momentarily, something unreadable passing across his features. Doing my job, Frank. Something you taught me a long time ago. Where are Sarah and Jason? Frank asked, tension building in his chest. Safe, at the station. The answer should have been reassuring, but something in Thompson's delivery set off alarm bells in Frank's mind. He noticed Duke shifting slightly, sensing the same wrongness. Bill, ma'am, Frank tried again. Where are the state police you mentioned? A thin smile crossed Thompson's face. Had to improvise there. They're still stuck on the highway. He gestured with his weapon. Now everyone outside, slowly. As they filed out of the cabin, Frank's mind raced. Thompson was lying about backup, which meant he was here alone. But why? And how had Sarah and Jason ended up at the police station when they should have been headed in the opposite direction? Outside, the night air had grown colder, their breath forming clouds in the beam of Thompson's flashlight. The sheriff directed them to stand together near the cabin's front steps. 15 years, Thompson said, his voice suddenly different, harder. 15 years I've waited for this moment. Reed spat on the ground. What are you talking about, old man? Thompson ignored him, focusing on Frank. You never figured it out, did you, Frank? All those years as partners, and you never once suspected. A terrible understanding began to dawn on Frank. Suspected what, Bill? That Cooper wasn't the only dirty cop in Pinewood. Thompson's smile was cold in the moonlight. That the drug operation needed someone higher up to function properly. Someone who could make evidence disappear, redirect investigations. Frank felt as though the ground had shifted beneath his feet. You were the one behind it all. Not all, Thompson admitted, but enough. Cooper was just the fall guy, the perfect patsy when things started unraveling. Young idealistic cop with a wife needing expensive cancer treatments. He shook his head. The money was the bait. I knew he'd take it. The revelation hit Frank like a physical blow. Cooper had been set up by his own boss, manipulated into taking the blame for a corruption scheme that went far beyond him. But when things went sideways, Thompson continued, when internal affairs got involved, Cooper panicked, said he was going to come clean, tell everything he knew. The sheriff's expression darkened. I couldn't allow that. You killed him. Frank said the truth finally clear after 15 years. Made it look like suicide. Thompson nodded almost imperceptibly. Had to. Too much at stake. And the missing money, Duke asked, never existed. Joe, Thompson's smile returned. That was the beauty of it. Create a legend about missing millions, and everyone's so busy looking for the treasure they never questioned the original story. Reed's face contorted with fury. You son of a bitch. You used my uncle, then killed him. Let my aunt die believing he was corrupt. Unfortunate collateral damage, Thompson said dismissively, but necessary. Frank struggled to process the magnitude of the betrayal. Bill Thompson, his friend and colleague for decades, had murdered James Cooper and allowed Frank to spend 15 years believing his partner was dirty. Why now, Frank asked. Why come clean after all this time? Thompson's expression shifted, something almost regretful crossing his features. Cancer, pancreatic. Doctor gives me 3 months tops. He gestured with the gun. Figured I'd tie up loose ends before I go. By killing us too, Duke surmised. Afraid so. Thompson shifted his weight, wincing slightly. Nothing personal, Duke, but you and your iron veterans have been a thorn in my side for years, cutting into my protection business. And my family, Frank demanded, cold rage building within him. Sarah and Jason, are they really at the station? Thompson hesitated, the first genuine emotion crossing his face. They're fine, Frank. I intercepted them on the road. They're locked in a cell at the station, but unharmed. I don't hurt women and children. Just frame innocent men and murder your friends, Frank countered bitterly. Thompson shrugged. We all have lines we won't cross. Helps us sleep at night. He raised his weapon more deliberately. Now who wants to go first? The moment stretched taut with tension. Frank's mind raced through options, calculating distances, angles, the likelihood of reaching Thompson before a bullet found him. The odds weren't good. Then almost imperceptibly, Duke nodded toward the tree line behind Thompson. Frank caught the movement from the corner of his eye but didn't react, keeping Thompson's attention fixed on him. "I trusted you, Bill," Frank said, taking a half step forward. "All these years." Thompson's aim didn't waver. "That was your mistake. Trust gets people killed in this business." "What business is that, law enforcement or drug trafficking?" Thompson's laugh was humorless. "In Pinewood, often the same thing." As he spoke, a shadow detached itself from the darkness behind him. One of Duke's iron veterans moving with the silent precision of a trained operator. Thompson focused on Frank, didn't notice until the muzzle of a rifle pressed against the base of his skull. "Drop it, Sheriff," came the quiet command. Thompson froze, then slowly lowered his weapon. "Clever," he conceded, "but this changes nothing. You can't prove any of what I've said." Frank stepped forward, retrieving Thompson's gun. "Actually, we can." He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew his phone. "Been recording since we stepped outside the cabin." Old habits. Thompson's face fell as he realized the magnitude of his error. 15 years of carefully constructed lies undone by a simple smartphone recording. "It's over, Bill," Frank said quietly. "Cooper gets his name cleared. Reed gets answers about his uncle, and you face justice for what you've done." As Duke's men secured Thompson, Frank turned to Reed, who stood in stunned silence, his worldview clearly shattered by the revelations. "I'm sorry about your uncle," Frank said. "He deserved better." Reed nodded slowly, the burning anger in his eyes dimming to something more complicated. "He talked about you, you know. Said if anything ever happened to him, I should trust Frank Sullivan." A bitter laugh escaped him. "Guess I should have led with that instead of burning down your cabin." And the comment was so unexpected that Frank found himself laughing, despite everything. Might have simplified things. Reed extended his hand. "Truce. At least until we get your family safe and this bastard behind bars." Frank hesitated only briefly before accepting the offered hand. "Truce." As they prepared to leave the cabin site, Frank took a moment to look at the photograph that had hung above the hidden safe. Cooper and him smiling, holding that rainbow trout between them. A reminder of simpler times of a friendship cut tragically short by betrayal and lies. "I'll make it right, James," Frank promised quietly. "Whatever it takes." The journey back to Pinewood was tense but uneventful. Thompson secured in Duke's vehicle, Reed and Frank following in Reed's truck. The temporary alliance between former enemies held bound by the shared shock of Thompson's betrayal and the urgent need to free Sarah and Jason. As they approached the sheriff's station, Frank was surprised to see lights blazing and multiple vehicles in the parking lot, including several state police cruisers. "Looks like your backup finally arrived," Reed observed dryly. Inside, they found organized chaos. State police officers processing members of the Nomad Riders who had apparently been apprehended while attempting to flee the area. Among the commotion, Frank spotted Sarah and Jason seated in the break room, unharmed, but clearly shaken. "Dad," Sarah called, rushing toward him. Jason followed, wrapping his arms around Frank's waist with surprising strength. "Are you okay?" Frank asked, embracing them both. "We're fine," Sarah assured him. "Confused, but fine. These officers brought us here, said there was a situation at the lodge." Frank looked up to see a state police captain approaching. "Sullivan, Captain Reeves, Montana State Police. Your sheriff has some explaining to do." Frank nodded grimly. "More than you know, Captain." The next hours passed in a blur of statements, recordings, and revelations. Thompson's confession captured on Frank's phone opened a floodgate of long-buried secrets. Additional evidence emerged as officers searched Thompson's home and office, revealing decades of corruption extending far beyond Cooper's case. Reed and his Nomad Riders, facing lesser charges, primarily related to the cabin arson, cooperated fully in exchange for reduced sentences. Duke and the Iron Veterans provided their own testimonies, filling in gaps in the complex web of small-town corruption that had ensnared them all. By dawn, Frank found himself sitting alone in the break room, nursing a cup of terrible coffee reminiscent of his military days. Sarah and Jason had finally been convinced to get some rest at a local motel, while the various law enforcement agencies continued processing the night's events. Duke entered, looking as exhausted as Frank felt, and dropped into the chair across from him. "Hell of a day, Sullivan." Frank nodded wearily. "Thompson fooled us all, 15 years. "Not all of us," Duke corrected. "Cooper knew something wasn't right. That's why he reached out to you that night." The observation hung between them, a painful reminder of Frank's failure to answer that final call. I should have been there for him. Duke shook his head firmly. Thompson would have killed you both. Then Sarah would have grown up without a father. Before Frank could respond, Captain Reeves entered the break room, his expression grave. Sullivan, we've got a situation. Thompson's requesting to speak with you. Says there's something you need to know about Cooper. Frank exchanged a glance with Duke, then rose. Let's hear what he has to say. Thompson sat handcuffed to the table in the station's single interview room. Looking smaller somehow, his authority stripped away along with his badge and gun. Frank, he acknowledged as they entered. Duke, didn't expect to see you both. What do you want, Bill? Frank asked, remaining standing. Thompson sighed heavily. Wanted to set one thing straight before they take me away. About Cooper. We know you killed him, Frank said. Made it look like suicide. Thompson shook his head slowly. That's just it. I didn't. Frank stared at him in disbelief. You admitted it at the cabin. I admitted to setting him up, to creating the conditions. Thompson met Frank's gaze steadily. But I didn't pull the trigger. Cooper really did kill himself. Why should we believe you now? Duke demanded. Thompson shrugged. No reason to lie anymore. I'm going away for life regardless. He leaned forward, chains rattling. Cooper figured it out, you know. Realized I was the one behind everything. That night he called me, confronted me. Said he had evidence, was going to turn me in. Frank felt a chill run through him. So you went to his house? To threaten him, yes, but when I got there he was already dead. Thompson's voice dropped. The poor bastard couldn't face it. Couldn't face being used, being corrupted against his will. Left a note, too. There was no note, Frank said sharply. There was. I took it. Thompson nodded to Captain Reeves. It's in my home safe, behind the painting in my study. Combination is my badge number. Reeves dispatched an officer immediately while Frank struggled to process this new revelation. Why take the note? He asked finally. Because it implicated me, Thompson replied simply. Cooper named names, said he was sorry he wasn't strong enough to face justice, but he couldn't live with what he'd become. The old sheriff's eyes held genuine regret. I used his wife's illness against him, Frank. Pushed him into a corner until he saw no way out. The admission hung in the air, devastating in its simplicity. Cooper had been manipulated, corrupted against his will, then driven to take his own life when the truth became unbearable. Why tell us now? Duke asked. Thompson considered the question. Maybe I want Cooper's family to know he wasn't just some dirty cop. He was a good man pushed too far. His gaze returned to Frank. And maybe I owe you the truth after 15 years of lies. Frank said nothing, his emotions too complex for words. Relief that his original assessment of Cooper's death had been correct, rage at Thompson's manipulation, and profound grief for the partner whose final message he'd missed. Before he could formulate a response, an officer entered with news. Thompson's safe had been opened, the suicide note found exactly where he'd described. Cooper's handwriting, his final words confirming everything Thompson had just revealed. As they left the interview room, Frank found himself standing in the hallway, the note in his hands, reading his partner's last words. The admission of guilt, the apology to his family, and a final message to Frank asking forgiveness for his weakness, expressing hope that Frank would someday understand the impossible choice he'd faced. He was a good cop, Duke said quietly, reading over Frank's shoulder. Just like you said. Frank nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. Dad? He looked up to find Sarah standing in the hallway, Jason beside her. They had returned from the motel, unable to sleep amidst the ongoing revelations. Is it over? Sarah asked. Frank folded the note carefully and tucked it into his pocket. Almost. Thompson's confessed to everything. Reed and his men are cooperating. It's going to take time to untangle it all, but yes, it's over. Sarah studied him with eyes so like her mother's. What about us? What happens now? The question hung between them, weighted with decades of distance and missed opportunities. Frank looked from his daughter to his grandson, then to Duke, who stood supportively nearby. That depends, Frank said carefully, on what you want to happen. Sarah's expression softened. I was thinking maybe we could stay in Pinewood for a while, help you rebuild the station, the cabin. My practice has a branch office in Billings, she continued. I could transfer work remotely part-time. She glanced at Jason. And someone needs to go to school here. The offer hung in the air between them, a chance at the family connection Frank had neglected for so long. "I'd like that," he said simply. "Very much." As daylight strengthened outside the station windows, Frank Sullivan found himself surrounded by unexpected allies and rediscovered family. The road ahead would be challenging relationships, to rebuild truths, to face about his past choices and failures. But for the first time in 15 years, he felt the weight of James Cooper's death lifting from his shoulders. Not gone entirely, perhaps never gone, but transformed into something he could carry with honor rather than guilt. His phone buzzed with a message from Reed. Uncle James would be proud. Truth still holds. Frank smiled slightly as he put the phone away. Cooper had always believed in redemption and second chances. Perhaps it wasn't too late for any of them. 1 month after Sheriff Bill Thompson's confession, autumn had fully claimed the mountains surrounding Pinewood. The aspens stood like golden sentinels among the dark pines, their leaves trembling in the crisp October wind. Frank Sullivan paused in his work, wiping sweat from his brow, despite the cool temperature, as he surveyed the progress on his rebuilt service station. The charred remnants of the original structure had been cleared away, replaced by a new frame that already showed the bones of what would become a larger, more modern facility. Where once had stood a simple gas station and repair shop, a proper garage with 3 service bays was taking shape. The insurance money had covered the basics, but the expansion came courtesy of a silent partner whose identity still surprised Frank whenever he thought about it. "Looks good," Duke Reynolds said, approaching with 2 cups of coffee from his truck. He handed one to Frank, then stood beside him, admiring the construction. "Another week you'll have walls and a roof." Frank accepted the coffee gratefully. "Ahead of schedule, thanks to your crew." Several Iron veterans were among the workers, their motorcycle vests traded for tool belts as they moved with practiced efficiency across the construction site. The alliance forged in crisis had evolved into something neither man had anticipated a month earlier. "Any word from the prosecutor on Thompson's case?" Duke asked, blowing steam from his cup. Frank nodded. "Grand jury returned indictments yesterday. Murder, conspiracy, corruption, evidence tampering. He'll never see daylight and again." And Cooper's name, officially cleared as of last week. Posthumous letter of exoneration from the governor. Frank's voice softened. "Reed's taking it to his grandmother today." The mention of Marcus Reed still felt strange on Frank's tongue, the name of a former enemy, now complicated by shared purpose and grudging respect. Reed had kept his word after Thompson's arrest, accepting a plea deal for the arson charges in exchange for testimony against the former sheriff. He now faced 18 months in a minimum security facility rather than the decade he might have served, a compromise Frank had personally endorsed to the prosecutor. "Speaking of Reed," Duke said, nodding toward the road where a black pickup truck had just pulled in. "Looks like he wanted to deliver the news in person." Reed parked beside the construction site and approached, his imposing physique drawing curious glances from the workers who hadn't been part of the events at Cooper's cabin. He nodded to Duke, then extended his hand to Frank. "Sullivan. Reed, didn't expect to see you today. Had some business to finish before I report to Deer Lodge next week." Reed's expression was unreadable, a mask perfected during his previous prison term. "Thought you'd want to know I delivered the exoneration papers to Grandma Helen." Frank studied him. "How'd she take it?" Something softened briefly in Reed's features. "Cried. Said she always knew in her heart James wasn't dirty." He paused. "She asked about you." This surprised Frank. Helen Cooper had barely acknowledged his existence at James's funeral 15 years earlier. "What did she say?" "Wanted to know if you were doing okay. Said she owed you an apology for how she treated you after James died." Reed shrugged. "Sighed. 92 years old and still proud as hell. Couldn't quite bring herself to say the words, but she wanted you to know." Frank nodded, understanding the unspoken message. "Tell her I never blamed her." "Not for a second." Reed hesitated, then reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope. "She also wanted you to have this. Found it going through James's old things." Frank accepted the envelope with curiosity. Inside was a faded photograph he'd never seen before, showing himself and Cooper as rookies, standing proudly beside their first patrol car. On the back in Cooper's handwriting, "Me and Sullivan, first day, best partner a guy could ask for." The simple inscription hit Frank with unexpected force. He cleared his throat, nodding his thanks to Reed. "There's something else," Reed said, his voice taking on a businesslike tone. I'm signing over my shares in the Nomad Riders' legitimate businesses to my cousin Cooper's son, but I'd like to make a change to the paperwork first. Frank raised an eyebrow questioningly. Adding your grandson as a beneficiary of the educational trust we set up years ago, Reed explained. We'll ride to any college he wants when the time comes. The offer caught Frank completely off guard. Reed, that's not necessary. It is to me. Reed's expression hardened slightly. My uncle lost everything trying to save his wife, his reputation, his life. His son grew up believing his father was corrupt. I can't fix all of that, but I can make sure your grandson doesn't miss opportunities because of what happened here. Frank looked to Duke, who nodded almost imperceptibly. After a moment's consideration, Frank extended his hand again. Jason will appreciate it someday. Thank you. Reed accepted the handshake, something like relief crossing his features. Good. Paperwork's with my lawyer. He'll be in touch. He glanced around the construction site. Place is looking good. Better than the old one. That was the idea, Frank agreed. Fresh start. Reed nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. Good luck with it, Sullivan. He turned to leave, then paused. When I get out, maybe I'll stop by. Get an oil change or something. I'll give you the law enforcement discount, Frank replied, with the ghost of a smile. After Reed departed, Duke chuckled softly. Never thought I'd see the day. Marcus Reed and Frank Sullivan practically friends. Not friends, Frank corrected, but not enemies anymore either. They finished their coffee in companionable silence, watching the construction progress. Frank's thoughts drifted to Sarah and Jason, currently at the elementary school where Sarah was finalizing Jason's enrollment. They had moved into Frank's house temporarily while looking for a place of their own in Pinewood, bringing life and noise to rooms that had been silent too long. Dad, Frank turned to see Sarah's Subaru pulling up to the construction site, Jason waving enthusiastically from the passenger window. They had clearly come directly from the school, Jason still wearing his backpack as he bounded from the car. Grandpa, I start Monday, he announced, excitement radiating from his face. And they have a science club and a chess team. Frank ruffled the boy's hair affectionately. That's so. Planning to join up. Both, Jason said confidently. Mom says I can if I keep my grades up. Sarah approached, more sedately nodding greetings to Duke and the workers. Everything went smoothly. Principal Morrison remembered you from when you used to coach baseball at the high school. Ted Morrison? Frank asked, surprised. He must be close to retirement age now. Actually, it's Teresa Morrison, Ted's daughter, Sarah corrected with a mischievous smile. She had quite a few stories about the legendary Coach Sullivan. Frank winced theatrically. Nothing too embarrassing, I hope. Only the one about you falling into the dugout during the championship game. Duke burst into laughter. That really happened. I thought it was just a town legend. Frank shook his head ruefully. Tripped over a bat someone left out. Landed flat on my back in front of the entire team and their parents. Jason giggled, clearly delighted by this glimpse of his grandfather's less dignified moments. Sarah watched them with a softness in her eyes that had been absent when they had arrived a month earlier. Principal Morrison also mentioned they're looking for volunteer coaches, she added casually. Said the baseball team could use someone with experience. Frank raised an eyebrow at his daughter. That your idea? Maybe. Sarah's expression turned more serious. You're good with kids, Dad. Always were when you had the time. The old accusation carried less sting, now softened by her slight smile. Jason could use a consistent male role model in his life. Frank glanced at his grandson, now engrossed in conversation with one of the Iron veterans, who was showing him how the table saw worked from a safe distance. I'll think about it, he promised. Sarah nodded, accepting this as progress. We're heading to the diner for lunch. Want to join us when you're done here? Save me a seat, Frank said. Should be wrapped up in about an hour. After Sarah and Jason departed, Duke gave Frank a knowing look. Coaching baseball again, town might not be ready for the return of Coach Sullivan and his legendary dugout dives. Frank chuckled, but his expression turned thoughtful. Never thought I'd have a second chance with them. With any of this, really. Life's full of surprises, Duke observed. Not all of them bad. The construction foreman called Duke over to consult on an electrical issue, leaving Frank alone with his thoughts. He looked again at the photograph Reed had delivered, tracing Cooper's handwriting with his thumb. Best partner a guy could ask for. After 15 years of doubt and guilt, The simple affirmation felt like absolution. Frank's phone rang, interrupting his reverie. The caller ID showed Captain Reeves from the state police. "Sullivan," he answered. "Frank, glad I caught you," Reeves said, his voice tight with what sounded like barely contained excitement. "We found something you need to see. How soon can you get to Helena?" Frank frowned. "Helena? What's this about?" "Thompson's been talking a lot. Part of his plea negotiation. He gave us information about a storage unit he's maintained for years under an alias." Reeves paused meaningfully. "We opened it this morning. Frank, you wouldn't believe what was inside." An hour later, Frank and Duke were heading east on the highway toward the state capitol, the construction site temporarily left in the capable hands of the foreman. Frank had called Sarah to explain the unexpected trip, promising to be back for dinner if possible. Thompson maintained a storage unit for 15 years without anyone knowing, Frank mused as Duke drove. "Man was more careful than I gave him credit for." Duke grunted agreement. "Always the ones you least suspect, though I guess we both suspected him eventually." As they approached the outskirts of Helena, a black SUV swerved suddenly into their lane, forcing Duke to brake hard. The vehicle pulled alongside them, the passenger window rolling down to reveal a face Frank recognized, one of Thompson's former deputies, a man named Mercer, who had disappeared shortly after Thompson's arrest. "Sullivan!" Mercer shouted over the road noise, his expression contorted with rage. "Thompson sends his regards." The SUV veered sharply toward them, metal scraping against metal as it forced Duke's truck toward the guardrail. Duke fought the wheel, his face a mask of concentration as he tried to maintain control. "Hold on," Duke shouted as he executed a swift counter-maneuver, drawing on decades of military driving experience. The truck fishtailed briefly, then straightened, allowing Duke to accelerate away from their attacker. Mercer wasn't done. The SUV surged forward again, this time attempting to clip their rear bumper. Frank grabbed his phone, dialing 911 while bracing himself against the dashboard. "State Police emergency," Frank barked into the phone. "This is Frank Sullivan, former lieutenant with Pinewood Sheriff's Department. We're under attack on Highway 12, 10 miles east of Townsend. Black Ford Explorer license plate." He craned his neck to see. "Charlie Echo 7593. Driver is former Deputy Daniel Mercer." As he spoke, Duke spotted an approaching state trooper and flashed his lights desperately. The patrol car's lights immediately activated, the trooper quickly assessing the situation and pulling in behind Mercer's SUV. Seeing the trooper, Mercer abandoned his assault, veering onto an exit ramp and accelerating away. The trooper followed, sirens wailing as the chase disappeared into the distance. "You okay?" Frank asked Duke, whose knuckles were white on the steering wheel. "Yeah." Duke took a deep breath, his heartbeat slowly returning to normal. "Thompson still has friends on the outside." "Not for long," Frank said grimly. "Not after this." They continued to Helena without further incident, both men processing the close call. The attack confirmed what Frank had suspected: Thompson's corruption had spread further than anyone realized, and those still loyal to him would go to extreme lengths to protect themselves. Captain Reeves met them at State Police headquarters, alarm evident on his face. "Just got word about what happened. You two all right?" "We're fine," Frank assured him. "Mercer." State trooper lost him into the back roads. "We've got an APB out. He won't get far." Reeves led them through the building to a secure evidence room. "After what just happened, I'm even more convinced you need to see this." Inside the evidence room, tables were covered with carefully labeled items: financial records, computer drives, weapons, and most prominently, dozens of labeled file boxes. Thompson kept records of everything, Reeves explained, gesturing to the collection. 15 years of blackmail material, financial transactions, names, dates. A complete account of corruption in 3 counties. Frank approached the nearest table, examining a ledger book with meticulous, handwritten entries. "These are payoff records," he realized. "Judges, council members, business owners. The whole system," Reeves confirmed. Thompson was just one node in a network that stretched across half the state. Some of these people are still in office. Duke whistled softly. "No wonder he wanted to keep this hidden. No wonder Mercer tried to stop us from getting here." "There's more," Reeves said, leading them to another table where several evidence bags contained what appeared to be old VHS tapes and audio cassettes. Recordings of meetings, incriminating phone calls. Thompson was paranoid, documented everything as insurance. Frank shook his head, the scale of the corruption dawning on him. How many people are we talking about? At least 40 individuals in positions of authority, Reeves replied, plus their associates. We're looking at the biggest corruption case in Montana history. As they continued examining the evidence, Reeves directed their attention to a specific file box labeled simply Cooper. This is what I thought you'd want to see, he said, opening the box. Inside were files related to James Cooper's case, but also something else, a small recording device and several microcassettes carefully labeled with dates. The final one was marked with the date of Cooper's death. Thompson recorded his conversation with Cooper that night, Reeves explained. We've had the lab enhance the audio quality, but it's clear enough. I thought you might want to hear it privately. Frank stared at the small tape, his heart suddenly pounding. Cooper's last words, his final confrontation with the man who had manipulated and betrayed him. Yes, he said quietly, I would. Reeves led them to a small conference room where a tape player had been set up. Take all the time you need. I'll be in my office when you're done. When the door closed behind Reeves, Frank sat motionless before the player, suddenly uncertain. You don't have to do this, Duke said gently. Some ghosts are better left undisturbed. Frank shook his head. I need to hear it. Need to know exactly what happened. He pressed play before he could reconsider. The tape began with static, then Thompson's voice, younger but recognizable. Cooper, it's nearly midnight. What's so urgent? Cooper's voice followed, sending a chill through Frank. His partner, 15 years dead, speaking across time. I know everything, Bill, about the drug money, about the protection racket, all of it. Don't know what you're talking about, James. You feeling all right? Don't. Cooper's voice hardened. I found the accounts, tracked the deposits. I know you set me up, used Elizabeth's cancer as leverage. A long pause, then Thompson's tone changed, dropping all pretense. How long have you known? Long enough to gather evidence. It's all documented, ready to go to the state attorney's office tomorrow morning. That would be a mistake, James. Think about Elizabeth. I am thinking about her. Cooper's voice cracked slightly. Think I could keep looking her in the eye, knowing what I've become, what I've done. We can work something out, more money for her treatments. A promotion for you once this blows over. It's over, Bill. I've already called Sullivan. Left him a message to meet me at the fishing cabin. I'm giving him everything. The mention of his name hit Frank like a physical blow. Cooper had indeed reached out, tried to tell him the truth. Thompson's voice turned cold. Sullivan, you trust him that much? With my life, Cooper replied without hesitation. He's a good cop, the best I've known. And what about your career, your reputation? Sullivan has to report this, you know that. By the book, always. You'll lose everything. Already have. Cooper sounded resigned but determined. All I can do now is try to make it right. The conversation continued, Thompson alternating between threats and bribes as Cooper remained resolute. Frank listened, hands clenched on the table edge, as his partner's final hours unfolded through audio that somehow captured both everything and nothing of the man. Finally, Thompson's voice again, dangerous in its calm. I can't let you do this, James. It's already done, Cooper replied. The evidence is secure. If anything happens to me, Sullivan gets everything automatically. A bluff, Frank realized. Cooper had left no such insurance policy. Then I guess we're at an impasse, Thompson said. I'll leave you to think about your next move carefully. For Elizabeth's sake. The recording captured footsteps, a door closing, then silence save for Cooper's heavy breathing. After a long moment, Cooper spoke again, apparently alone. Frank, if you ever hear this, I'm sorry. Should have been stronger. Should have come to you sooner. Take care of Elizabeth if you can. And don't blame yourself. None of this is on you. The tape clicked off. Frank sat motionless, tears tracking silently down his weathered face. Duke placed a hand on his shoulder, saying nothing, allowing Frank the space to process what they'd heard. He didn't know, Frank finally said. Cooper didn't know Thompson would come back and kill him. He thought he'd won. Thompson said he found Cooper already dead, Duke reminded him. That Cooper killed himself. Frank shook his head. Listen to that tape. Does that sound like a man about to commit suicide? He had a plan. He was fighting back. Then Thompson lied again, Duke concluded, even in his confession. Frank rewound the tape, listening again to the final exchange, then to Cooper's solitary words. The resignation in his partner's voice didn't match the determination of his earlier statements. Something happened after Thompson left, Frank said slowly. Something that broke him. He looked up at Duke, a terrible understanding dawning. Elizabeth, Thompson must have threatened her directly, not just withdrawn support for her treatment. Duke nodded grimly. Would explain why Cooper suddenly lost hope. If he believed his wife would suffer for his whistleblowing, he made the only choice he thought he had left, Frank finished, protecting her the only way he could. They sat in silence, the weight of the revelations settling between them. Cooper's death had been neither simple suicide nor direct murder, but something more insidious, a man manipulated into taking his own life to protect those he loved. Thompson should rot for this, Duke said, finally, anger evident in his voice. He will, Frank assured him, but not just for Cooper, for all of it. He gestured to the evidence waiting in the other room. Cooper's sacrifice won't be wasted. His name will be cleared, and the entire corrupt system Thompson built will come down with him. Their drive back to Pinewood was subdued, both men processing the revelations of the day. But as they approached the town limits, a familiar black SUV appeared in the rearview mirror, closing fast. Mercer, Duke said grimly. He's back. And desperate, Frank added, reaching for his phone. Before he could dial, Mercer's SUV rammed them from behind, the impact jerking them forward against their seatbelts. Duke fought to maintain control as Mercer pulled alongside, this time with a pistol visible in his hand. Get down, Frank shouted as Mercer fired the bullet, shattering the passenger window. Glass showered over Frank as he ducked, drawing his own weapon, the Colt 1911 he'd carried faithfully for decades. Duke swerved hard, creating space between the vehicles as they approached the outskirts of Pinewood. Frank opened his door slightly, using it as partial cover as he returned fire. His first shot missed, but the second caught Mercer's front tire, sending the SUV into a wild skid. The SUV careened off the road, rolling twice before coming to rest upside down in a roadside ditch. Frank and Duke pulled over a safe distance away, approaching cautiously with weapons drawn. Mercer lay half ejected from the vehicle, bleeding badly but still conscious. His gun had been thrown clear into the crash. Why Mercer? Frank asked as Duke called for an ambulance. Why throw everything away for Thompson? Mercer coughed, blood staining his lips. You don't understand. Thompson wasn't just my boss. He saved my family when no one else would. His eyes, growing unfocused, fixed on Frank. My daughter needed surgery. Insurance wouldn't cover it. Thompson paid for everything. A bitter laugh escaped him. Sound familiar, Sullivan? Just like Cooper. Frank felt sick. Thompson's pattern of manipulation had claimed more victims than he'd realized. He used you just like he used Cooper. Maybe, Mercer admitted, his voice weakening, but a debt's a debt, and Thompson always collects. By the time the ambulance and police arrived, Mercer had lost consciousness. He would survive, the paramedics assured them, though he faced a long recovery, followed by multiple felony charges. Frank and Duke gave their statements to the responding officers, then continued toward Pinewood, both shaken by the second attack but resolute in their understanding of what needed to be done. Thompson's network is unraveling, Duke observed. Desperate men make desperate moves. Frank nodded, staring out at the mountains surrounding their town. Won't be the last. There are 40 names in those files, 40 people with everything to lose. You thinking of backing off? Duke asked, though he clearly knew the answer. Frank's expression hardened. Not a chance. Cooper deserves justice. They all do. Mercer's daughter, Reed's aunt, everyone Thompson used. When they finally reached Pinewood, it was late afternoon. Frank found Sarah and Jason waiting anxiously at his house, alerted by local gossip about the shooting. Dad, Sarah rushed to meet him as he climbed stiffly from Duke's truck. Her eyes widened at the cuts on his face from the shattered glass. What happened? Everyone in town's talking about a shootout on the highway. Frank embraced his daughter, holding her perhaps longer than necessary. Over her shoulder, he saw Jason watching with odd, frightened eyes. I'm okay, Oi, he assured them both. Just a close call. Inside, Frank cleaned up and changed clothes while Sarah made coffee. Jason sat at the kitchen table, unusually quiet, drawing something in a school notebook. What are you working on, buddy? Frank asked, taking a seat beside his grandson. Jason pushed the drawing toward him. It showed a crude but recognizable figure that was clearly Frank, standing protectively in front of two smaller figures representing Sarah and Jason. The Frank figure was holding something that might have been a badge or a shield. Mom says you were a hero today, Jason said simply, that you stopped a bad man. Frank studied the drawing, touched by the simple trust it represented. Your mom exaggerates, he said gently. I just did what needed doing. Like when you were a police officer. Something like that. Frank glanced at Sarah, who watched them with an unreadable expression. Sometimes being there for the people you love means doing hard things. Jason considered this with the seriousness only a child could muster. Is that why you weren't around much when Mom was little? Because you were doing hard things for other people? The innocent question cut to the heart of the guilt Frank had carried for decades. Before he could formulate an answer, Sarah joined them at the table. Your grandpa had an important job, she said, surprising Frank with her gentle tone. He helped a lot of people, and now he's here to help us. She squeezed Frank's hand briefly. Better late than never. That evening, after Jason had gone to bed, Frank and Sarah sat on the back porch watching the stars appear over the mountains. Frank had shared the day's discoveries, including Cooper's recording and the evidence of Thompson's widespread corruption. So, Thompson manipulated everyone, Sarah summarized. Cooper Mercer, probably dozens of others, used their families as leverage. It's what predators do, Frank said. Find your weakness and exploit it. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Was I your weakness, Dad? The reason you kept everyone at arm's length? Frank looked at his daughter and really looked at her, seeing not just the woman she'd become, but the little girl he'd failed so many times. Not my weakness, my strength. But I was afraid of what might happen if the job followed me home. If I made the wrong enemy. If someone decided to hurt me by hurting you. Like Thompson did to Cooper, Sarah said softly. Like Thompson did to everyone. Frank sighed. So I built walls, kept my distance, thought I was protecting you, but really, you were just missing out, Sarah finished for him. And so was I. They sat in companionable silence, the acknowledgement of past wounds somehow less painful than Frank had feared. Not forgiveness exactly, but understanding. The beginning of healing. Principal Morrison called while you were gone, Sarah said eventually. The baseball team meets tomorrow after school for practice. She asked if you'd come observe, maybe offer some pointers. Frank raised an eyebrow. You told her I'd do it, didn't you? Sarah's smile was answer enough. Jason's excited. Says all his new friends think it's cool his grandpa was a police lieutenant and might coach the team. Might is the operative word, Frank cautioned, though they both knew he'd already decided. The following morning dawned bright and cold, the aspens around Frank's house glowing golden in the sunrise. Frank rose early, made coffee, and stepped onto the back porch, feeling a strange sense of peace despite the violence and revelations of the previous day. His phone rang. Captain Reeves. Sullivan, we picked up 2 more of Thompson's network overnight, Reeves reported. They came in voluntarily after news about Mercer spread. Started talking immediately, confirming everything in Thompson's files. The dominoes are falling, Frank observed, rapidly. We'll need your testimony eventually, but for now, things are moving along without you. Thought you might appreciate the breathing room. Frank watched an eagle soar over the distant pines. I do. Got some things to take care of here. Family things, Reeves asked knowingly. Baseball practice, Frank replied. My grandson's team needs a coach. After ending the call, Frank found Sarah in the kitchen making breakfast. Jason was already at the table dressed for school, but focused intently on a handheld chess computer Duke had given him. Checkmate, the device announced, drawing a frustrated groan from the boy. Tough opponent, Frank asked, pouring himself another coffee. Jason looked up, determination in his young face. I almost had it. 3 more moves and I would have won. Want some advice? Frank pulled up a chair, examining the small screen. Chess is about patience, thinking several moves ahead, not rushing into things. Like police work? Jason asked. Frank chuckled. Exactly like police work. Or coaching baseball. Or being a grandfather. He reset the game, showing Jason a different opening strategy. Sometimes the best move isn't the obvious one. As they worked through the game together, Frank caught Sarah watching them, a smile playing at her lips. The moment felt precious in its ordinary perfection, a grandfather teaching his grandson breakfast cooking on the stove, morning sunlight streaming through windows. Later that day, Frank stood at the edge of the Pinewood Elementary baseball field, watching a dozen boys and girls run drills under the supervision of a harried-looking young teacher. Jason waved from his position in right field, pride evident in his posture. Principal Morrison approached, extending her hand. Mr. Sullivan, thank you for coming. Frank, please. He shook her hand, suddenly feeling oddly nervous. Teresa, right, I remember when your dad coached me in Little League. She smiled. He remembers you too. Said you had the best arm he'd ever seen in a 12-year-old. That was a long time ago. Not so long that these kids couldn't benefit from your experience. She gestured at the chaotic practice. Our regular coach moved to Billings last month. We've been making do, but Frank watched as a routine grounder skipped between three different fielders, none quite sure who should field it. I see the problem. Would you consider taking over just until we find someone permanent? Frank already knew his answer. Had known it since Durst first mentioned the possibility. Perhaps had known it since the moment Jason had shown him that drawing of a protector standing guard over his family. I'll do it, he said simply. The principal's relief was palpable. Wonderful, I'll introduce you to the team. As Frank walked onto the field, he felt a strange sensation, the weight of the past lifting slightly from his shoulders. Cooper's death would always be part of him, as would the failures and regrets of his life. But here on this field, with his grandson watching and a new generation waiting for guidance, Frank Sullivan found something he'd thought lost forever, a second chance. The kids gathered around, curious about the weathered man their principal introduced as Coach Sullivan. Frank surveyed them, seeing in their faces the same mixture of uncertainty and hope he'd once seen in young officers under his command. Baseball, he began, his voice finding its natural authority, is about more than catching and throwing. It's about trust, knowing your teammates have your back, knowing when to step up and when to let someone else take the lead. He demonstrated a proper fielding stance, moving with the fluid precision of someone who had never quite forgotten the lessons of his youth. It's about discipline, focus, and sometimes, he added with a slight smile, it's about picking yourself up when you fall into the dugout. Jason giggled at this, prompting curious looks from his teammates. The story would soon have become legend among them, Frank knew. The tale of their coach's most embarrassing moment, passed down like all good stories should be. As the practice continued, Frank found himself falling into the familiar rhythms of coaching, correcting stances, demonstrating techniques, offering encouragement where needed and discipline where required. The kids responded to his calm authority, their chaotic efforts gradually coalescing into something resembling proper baseball. From the sidelines, Sarah watched with a smile that reached her eyes, truly reached them for the first time since she'd arrived in Pinewood. When practice ended, the team dispersed to waiting parents, their chatter more animated than when they'd arrived. Jason lingered, helping Frank collect equipment. Did I do okay, Grandpa? He asked, a vulnerability in his voice that reminded Frank painfully of Sarah at the same age. Frank set down the bat bag and crouched to his grandson's level, meeting his eyes directly. You did great, buddy. And you know what? You're going to get even better. Jason beamed at the simple praise, then grew serious again. Mom says we're staying in Pinewood, that we're not going back to live with Dad. How do you feel about that? Jason considered the question with surprising maturity. Dad yelled a lot, made Mom cry. He looked at the baseball mitt on his hand, a new purchase they'd made that morning. I like it here, with you. Frank felt something shift inside him, a wound beginning to heal. I like having you here too, both of you. Sarah joined them, her hair catching the late afternoon sun. Ready to head home, I'm thinking pizza night to celebrate the new coach. As they walked toward the parking lot, Frank felt his phone vibrate. A text from Reed. Heard about Mercer. You okay? Frank typed a quick response. All good. Taking my grandson for pizza. Coach Sullivan is back in business. Reed's reply came moments later. Cooper would be proud of all of it. Frank slipped the phone back into his pocket, a slight smile touching his lips. Ahead, Sarah and Jason walked together, the boy animatedly describing a play he'd made at practice, his mother listening with genuine interest. Frank Sullivan followed his family across the baseball field, where he'd once played as a boy, where he'd later coached as a young man, and where he now returned as a grandfather. The mountains stood eternal witness, their peaks touched by the golden light of afternoon, their valleys already deepening toward evening. Another day ending, another beginning on its heels. Life continuing as it always had and always would, carrying forward the stories of those who had come before and those yet to write their own chapters in the ongoing tale of loyalty, justice, and redemption. Behind him, the baseball diamond waited for tomorrow's practice. Before him, his family waited for tonight's dinner. And within him, at long last, Frank Sullivan found the peace that comes from knowing exactly where you belong.